Greetings, friends, and welcome to another podcast from the heart of Spurgeon. My name is Jeremy Walker, and we're working our way through these sermons week by week, reading by reading, focusing each week on a featured sermon that represents the best of the output of this gifted and much blessed man of God, Charles Spurgeon, whom the Lord employed to glorify his name in Victorian England in particular, but also around the United Kingdom, across Europe, and indeed internationally. There's a reason why we still appreciate and esteem his ministry today, and it is because the Lord God gifted him for the making known of his Son, Jesus Christ, in ways that are still appreciated, and from which we can learn both as Christians and as pastors and preachers, if that's what the Lord has called us to. So, if you want to know more, you can find out a little extra at mediagratiae.org/podcasts, where you can, amongst other things, sign up for a weekly newsletter giving you the featured sermon. You can find us on X at Reading Spurgeon. And if you'd like to share the blessing with others that you might get from these studies, then please do leave us a review on your favourite podcast app, especially if you live outside the United States. It makes a genuine difference to us, and we do appreciate you listening as you go through week by week. So, this week we've come to Sermon 1513 in volume 26. So, if you are reading along with the daily readings, we really are making wonderful progress, and this is our first featured sermon from volume 26. In some ways, it's a great counterpart, not even really a counterpoint, to the sermon that we looked at just last week. If you are able to plug into that, it was called the Dromedaries. It was sermon 1504. But if the former sermon is intended to help us find our proper place, the purpose of this one is, and I quote Spurgeon, "for every man to have a good spirit in his present place, so as to occupy it worthily." I will suppose, dear friends, he says, that in the providence of God you are in your place, and that by the direction of God's Spirit you have also sought and found the precise form of usefulness in which you ought to exercise yourself. Tonight it shall not be my business to arrange you, but assuming that it's well for you to keep where you are, my object shall be to encourage you to do your work for your Lord without being cast down. I am hardly going to preach so much as to talk to different persons who are discouraged in the work of the Lord, that we may rouse them up, rally them round us, and encourage them to keep rank. So there's the threefold purpose: rousing, rallying, and ranking. And the intention is reflected in the tone, not so much preaching as talking to different persons. So what you end up then with is these 6 broad strokes in the sermon, in which Spurgeon identifies 6 classes or categories of Christian workers: those who think they can do nothing, those who think they're laid aside, those who have only small talent, those who are under great difficulties, those who are not appreciated, and those who are discouraged because they have so little success. And whereas a lot of Spurgeon's sermons are divided up fairly distinctly, you can really trace out those main headings and then subheadings and subpoints, and that's often reflected in the text. This one is remarkably conversational, and it really does testify to his intent, really to talk to his hearers. So there won't be as much firstly, secondly, thirdly, outside of those 6 broad strokes, the 6 classes of Christian workers, but this much more, I suppose you could almost call it a natural tone, this conversational approach. It's still proclamational, it's still direct, but it has this particular arrangement and particular approach that it's worth thinking about if we're ministers. What are the different tones that we could take in the pulpit? What kind of approaches might we take? Are there different ways that we could address our congregations that might win ears at certain times? And here you've got people who need particular encouragements, who need to be roused up because they're discouraged, rallied around those who are working, and encouraged to keep rank. Let's dive in then, first of all, with those who think they can do nothing. The kind of people who will tell the preacher that such a sermon has nothing to do with them, not a sentence can concern them. If I am to encourage men to the service of the house of the Lord, it will be in vain for them, as they can do nothing at all. Some people come into a service with that in their minds. They've already decided that nothing will be of any use to them. Some people will say this to a preacher at the end of a service. It sounds like Spurgeon's had that experience himself, and you might be surprised to hear what people say, what some people at least might say to a minister after he's poured out his soul in preaching the truth. Well, dear friends, says Spurgeon, you must not take for granted that there's nothing that you can do. I want to remind you, and there's immediately a gentle but really quite firm nudge that too often cannot means will not. And not to have triumphed may mean that you have not tried. Yes, there's discouragement, but you've been so discouraged that you've excused yourself for inaction, and your inaction has grown into indolence or laziness. He asks if a man, under the notion that he couldn't lift his right hand, constantly kept it still, would you be surprised if after weeks and months it became a matter of fact that he didn't have the power to use his hand? It might actually stiffen for no reason other than that he had not moved it. And so, get going, says Spurgeon, before your muscles get rigid. A special word for the younger folk. If you do not work for the Lord almost as soon as you are converted, it will be very difficult afterwards to make you take to it. Aptitude, I've often noticed, comes with employment, and through negligence and sloth, people become enervated and helpless. So watch out that you don't start making excuses, a cannot in the place of a will not. So, I think it's interesting that in a sermon that's intended to be encouraging, the first thing Spurgeon does is make sure you're entitled to the encouragement. He probes away there to ensure that we are not being lazy. So, especially interesting, the insight that people who don't start off by working rarely get to working. And I think that's been proved in my experience, and I imagine in the experience of many others. It's very hard to galvanize somebody who's got spiritual inertia but no spiritual momentum. But he says, let's assume that what you've said is true. Perhaps you're ill. The vigor you felt in the bright days of health fails you now. Now you're suffering pain and weariness and exhaustion. This often comes with old age, and a pastor will often find older saints in particular who were often very vigorous and eager in their younger and healthier days, now grieving that they can do nothing. Now that may not be true, but it feels true in comparison to where they have been before. And Spurgeon says, yes, we understand that that is so. You wish you could serve the Lord. How constantly you've dreamed of the pleasure since you have been denied the privilege. So he's saying, don't make a mistake here, but let's at least work on the assumption that you are indeed in some way be laid aside. So how will he encourage us? Well, first by reminding us that the law of the son of David is the same as the law of David himself. And you know the law of David about those who went up to the battle. So he's maybe thinking here in his context of this sermon, cheer up my comrades. 2 Chronicles 35 verse 2, Josiah set the priests in their charges, encouraged them to the service of the house of the Lord, that he's, as it were, digging into the experience of some of the kings, and here he is with David himself. There were some who were lame, otherwise incapable of action, and David left them with the baggage. And Spurgeon says, if by sickness you're detained at home, or for any other reason, if because of age or infirmity you're not able to enter into actual service, yet if you are a true soldier and would fight if you could, and your heart is in it, you shall share even with the best and bravest of those who, clad in the panoply of God, the full armour of God, encounter and grapple with the adversary. He says further that you've no reason to envy, though you may admire to your heart's content, all who are diligent and successful in the service of Christ. And perhaps this would be true for those who see others who've got greater gifts than they have, although that's something that Spurgeon brings out later in particular. So, because you cannot do much, you must not infer, for example, that therefore you're not saved. For if you were to be among the chief of Christian workers, it would not prove that you were certainly a child of God. So do not fret because you are shut out from the cheerful activities in which others share. For as long as your name is written in heaven, and your heart truly follows after the Lord, you shall have an abundant recompense at the last day, even though here you are doomed to be a sufferer rather than a worker. Then again, he raises the possibility that some of the friends to whom he speaks have minds which are tinged with melancholy, and who have therefore painted their own lot or position in deeper shades than the justice of the case deserves. Are you patient under your sufferings, he asks? Do you try to keep the flesh in subjection, to govern your spirit, to refrain from murmuring, and to foster cheerfulness? That, my friend, is doing a great deal. I am sure that the holy serenity of a suffering child of God is one of the best sermons that can ever be preached in a family. A sick saint has often been more serviceable in a house than the most eloquent divine could have been. They see how sweetly you submit to the divine will, how patiently you can bear painful operations, how the Lord gives you songs in the night. Why, you are greatly useful. It's worth asking, in an environment where so often we have ready remedies for many afflictions, how complaining and bitter and resentful we can be, even of relatively small afflictions. You might be able to hear in my voice this time, I'm recovering from a cold. How gentle and patient and submissive have I been while I've been struggling with lack of oxygen and hacking cough and running nose and all those sorts of things. Even in something so relatively ordinary, we can be very badly responsive. Sometimes it's just impatience. Sometimes it might be melancholy that leads us into those circumstances. And you'll know perhaps if you're unwell for a long period of time that melancholy can become a particular problem. So Christian ministers have said that they've derived more benefit from sitting half an hour talking to poor old Betsy, some particular sufferer, than they did from all the books in their library. And yet Betsy said that she was doing nothing. And again, I think a lot of us who minister the gospel, when we're making our pastoral house calls, speaking to a grieving widow, speaking to an unwell saint, their responses can do our souls more good than any good that we do to them. So look at your case in that light, says Spurgeon, and you will see that you can praise God upon your bed and make your chamber to be as vocal for God as this pulpit can ever be. Then he says, do you not think that we frequently limit our estimate of serving God to the public exercises of the sanctuary and forget the strong claims that our Lord has upon our private fidelity and obedience? In other words, Spurgeon is saying, have you forgotten that a lot of the work that you do for the Lord is not necessarily the work that everybody sees you doing? You say, I cannot serve God, because you cannot teach in the school or preach in the pulpit, when you're unable to sit on a committee or speak on a platform, as if these were the only forms of service to be taken into account. Do you not think that a mother nursing her baby is serving God? Do you not think that men and women going about their daily toil with patient industry, discharging the duties of domestic life, are serving God? If you think rightly, you will understand that they are. The servant sweeping the room, the mistress preparing the meal, the workman driving a nail, The merchant casting up his ledger ought to do all in the service of God. So, though you may be laid aside from the more public investments to which you are accustomed, don't overlook the private acts of faith and love. Let the stream of your common life as it flows on, obscure, unobserved, be holy and courageous. You will find that while they also serve who only stand and wait, you shall not be neglected or overlooked, who simply sit at Jesus' feet and listen to his words when you can do no more. Then, says Spurgeon, know too, speaking particularly here to a sister, that by your sorrows the Lord has drawn out your sympathies, that you, my brother, know by the discipline which has chastened you, that you have learned to be a comforter. Now, Spurgeon isn't saying that these are distinctly masculine or feminine experiences, but he's trying to be very specific, making sure that we understand he's talking to you, man over there, you, woman sitting here, you, the young sister who's struggling in this respect, you, the young man who's facing these particular battles. You dear, kind Christian men and women who think that you are not able to do anything but to condole or to console with cheery words some souls cast down and sore dismayed, are fulfilling a most blessed office and doing work which many ministers find it difficult to perform. And Spurgeon's point is that you have learned to do that by being a sufferer on your own account. God's tried people comfort each other con amore. They take to the work as a fish to water. Spurgeon is trying to remind us that there are some people who never struggle with any sort of affliction or distress, and therefore they are not always the most gifted for ministry. Now, be careful with that. Don't then turn around to someone who tries to comfort you and say, you don't know what I'm feeling, you've never had this kind of experience, but understand that it is by trial that often we are fitted for this particular service. You get to understand the art of speaking a word in season to him who is weary, and when this is the case, you need not complain that you are doing nothing. And yet, beloved, he goes on, you who thought that you did nothing and now perceive that you are really useful, will, I hope, perceive that there is still a wider region into which you may advance. Breathe tonight the prayer of Jabez, who was more honourable than his brothers, because he was the child of his mother's sorrows, and this was the prayer, oh, that you would bless me indeed, and enlarge my coast. Ask God to open up to you a larger region of usefulness, and he will do it. So that's quite a substantial section. A lot of the others are relatively brief by comparison, though they're all of slightly different lengths. So the second then, those who think that they are laid aside. These times need so much Christian effort that when a man asks me, how shall I do work for Christ, I am accustomed to say, go and do it. But what's the way to do it? Start at once. Get at it, my brother. Do not be out of harness a minute. Here's a response to someone who says, I want to be encouraged. I used to be useful. I was recognized as having something to offer, but I've moved to a different place. I'm in a different situation. I wish that I could get to work. Spurgeon says, well, first of all, get on with work. If it's simply a matter that you're not where you used to be and you don't have the opportunities you used to have, then at least you can get on with the work that has been put in your hand. But what if you're obliged to desist a while? So again here, you've got this sort of careful pastoral dealing. Before he actually deals with the issue itself, he wants to make sure that people aren't using this kind of language as an excuse. What if you're in a retired and inactive position? Then be preparing for the time when God brings you out again. If you're put away on a shelf, don't rust there, but pray the Master to brighten you up, so that when he comes to use you again, you may be fully fitted for the work which he has in hand for you. Or, if you are laid aside, pray for others who are at work. Help them. Encourage them. Do not get into that peevish, miserable frame of mind which grudges and undervalues other men's works. That's a really important point. not being like the dog in the manger in Aesop's fable. Some people, when they cannot do anything themselves, do not like anybody else to be diligent and laborious, and may even start complaining at and undermining them. So say, if I cannot help, I will never hinder, but I will cheer my brothers. Then spend your time in prayer, that you may be fit for the Master's use, and meanwhile be prompt in helping others. There may be some things that you cannot do, but at least there are some things that you could and should do. And he uses the example of heating the shot in naval warfare, or sometimes bombardment, especially of ships offshore. They would often heat up the cannonballs. It helped the balls fly quicker and truer when they were first fired, and it also meant that, especially if they were hitting ships, there was a greater chance of those ships catching fire. So Spurgeon says you might not be necessarily firing the guns yourself, but you could at least be heating the shot so that the gunners have something with which to work. So make the sermon red hot when it's fired off through your earnest prayers. The third category, we've had the people who think that they can do nothing. Now we've had the people who think that they're laid aside. Now we've got those who are discouraged because they've got only small talent. They don't have much to offer. They wish they could serve Christ like a Paul or a Whitfield, but they're not. Slow of speech and dull of thought, perhaps. They strive, but they don't do very much. And again, I think perhaps a lot of preachers and teachers feel like this. They're more conscious of what they lack than of what they have. And that's a temptation. But don't be entangled in the snare of thinking that because you cannot do everything you might wish, that you cannot do anything at all. Satan often tries to undermine us in that respect, to end up with us doing almost nothing because we can't do everything. And it's a false principle. Spurgeon says, use what you have. A sinner may be brought to Christ by the simple earnestness of a peasant or an artisan. He means a manual labourer, without calling in the aid of a professor's learning or a preacher's eloquence. God can bless you far above what you think to be your capacity, for it is not a question of your ability, but of his aid. That's such, again, a significant and a simple principle. It's not your ability that brings the blessing, but the aid of God, the mercy of the Lord. And then, as you're not enriched with many talents, economize or make the most of those that you have. Activity often makes up for a lack of ability. If you cannot get force by the weight of the ball, get it by the velocity with which it travels. A little man with one talent all ablaze may become a perfect nuisance to the devil and a champion for Christ. As for that great divine with his 5 talents, who marches on so sleepily, Satan can always overmarch him and win the day. If you can but turn over your 1 talent again and again in the name of God, you may achieve great wonders. Then what about those who are under great difficulties, our 4th category of worker? I have known the day when perplexities pleased me, dilemmas afforded me delight, and instead of declining a difficult task, I rather liked it. Even now I enjoy puzzling over a problem and attempting what others decline. Nothing good in this world can be effected without difficulty. You're not like Spurgeon. You don't have to be. But it's interesting that that was his basic disposition. He says that which is easy to do is hardly worth doing. In the face of difficulty, the man of ardent, persevering spirit braces up his nerves, sharpens his wits, and brings all his powers into play to achieve an object that will reward his efforts. So if you're facing difficulties, don't, says Spurgeon, just flag, don't back off. Use that as an opportunity to serve the Lord God. If you're going to build a city without difficulty, it won't be Jerusalem, you can be sure of that. As soon as ever you begin working for God, you will find a great power working against you. So if you encounter opposition, take it as a good sign. This is such a different mentality to the one that so often we see today, when any kind of difficulty or obstacle is almost interpreted as a providential reason not for us to proceed. But if Christ's cause prospers, the world is going to reproach the soul winner. If you do damage to the devil's kingdom, he will roar at you. If the king's enemies think you troublesome, reckon it to be high praise. When you, my dear brother, meet with opposition, encounter it with prayer. Exercise more faith. Antagonists ought never to hinder your going forward in the cause of Christ. So the forces ranged against you might be stumbling blocks to fools, but they should only prove a stimulus to men. One day your honour shall be the greater, and your reward shall be the higher, because of these adverse elements. So be brave and fear not, but advance in the strength of God. Again, Spurgeon is saying, change the way that you think about these things. Now, there's another class of workers who need encouragement, those who are unappreciated. I'm not going to say much, he says, because I haven't got much sympathy with them. Yet I know that the smallest slight chafes those who are oversensitive. Again, it's gracious and it's loving, but it's not sentimental, this kind of preaching. Spurgeon isn't giving in to people who are just finding things difficult and martyrs to their own self-pity. Spurgeon says, you think yourself a martyr and complain that you're misrepresented. Well, so what, dear friend? Be it so. That was your master's lot, and it's the lot of all his servants. This is a cross we must all carry, or we shall never wear the crown. Do you think this is a new experience, he asks? Look at Joseph. His brothers couldn't bear him, and yet it was he that saved the family and fed them in time of famine. Look at David. His brothers asked why he'd left the charge of the sheep to come down to the battle, suspecting that the pride of his heart had brought him among the soldiers in the standards. Yet nobody could bring back Goliath's head but that young David. So take a lesson from the ruddy hero, the red-cheeked hero. Take no notice of what your brothers say about you. Go and bring back the giant's head. A good adventure is the best answer to evil accusations. If you are serving the master, let their scandals stir you up to more self-consecration. If they cry out against you as too forward, serve the Lord with more vigour, and you will antidote the venom of their tongues. Did you enter into Christ's work in order to be honoured among men? Then retire from it, for you came with a bad motive. But if you enlisted purely to bring honour to him and to win his smile, what more do you want? What more do you want? Be not therefore disheartened because you are not applauded. Be certain of this, that to be kept in the rear rank is often necessary to future eminence. If you take a man and put him in front and pat him on the back and say, well, what a great man he is, he'll make a false step before long, and there will be an end of your hero. But when a man is brought forward by God, he's often one whom everybody criticises, finds fault with, and declaims as an impostor, but the banter he is exposed to serves as ballast for his mind. So the Lord will often use that slander, that assault, that dismissive attitude that you face to equip you for the work that he's given you to do and to teach you to stand firm. And then, in the last place, those who are discouraged because they've had so little success. And again, Spurgeon enters into sympathy with them. He talks about a splendid band of men and women who are the Sunday school teachers of this church. You'll think it strange, he says, that I did not till then thoroughly estimate the extent of their work, as I have never added up the total of the various schools. But when I did so and found that they mounted up to 6,000 children, I felt full of joy. And he speaks to those who are teaching, sometimes in the back streets, in rooms not connected with any place but this, people who are unknown, pursuing a simple, unobtrusive labour quietly. What if you fear that you've toiled in vain and have spent your strength for nothing? To them Spurgeon says, I would entreat you, dear friends, not to be satisfied with casting in the seed unless you reap some good results. Yet do not be so faint-hearted as to give up because of a little disappointment. Though you cannot be satisfied without fruit, yet do not cease to sow because one season proves a failure. He reminds them of Noah's ministry, a preacher of righteousness for 120 years, and yet he never brought a soul into the ark except his own family. Poor preaching we may count it, judging by the influence it exerted, and yet we know that it was grand preaching such as God commended. So do not grudge the time or the strength you lay out in the service of our great Lord, because you do not see your efforts thrive, for better men than you have wept over failure. Remember further that if you really do serve the Lord thoroughly and heartily, he will accept you and acknowledge your service, even though no good should come of it. If you've ploughed and if you have sowed, although there should be no harvest, you are clear and accepted. Did it never strike you that you may be now employed in breaking up ground and preparing the soil, from which other labourers who come after you will reap very plentifully? Perhaps your master knows what a capital ploughman you are. He has a large farm, and he never means to let you become a reaper because you do the ploughing so well. Your master does not intend you to take part in the harvest because you're such a good hand at sowing, and as he has crops that need sowing all the year round, he keeps you at that work. He knows you better than you know yourself. That's a really good reminder to those of us who labour in places where there seems to be a lot of ploughing and a lot of sowing, but very little in the way of present reaping. It's the divine economy, says Spurgeon, and actually your joy ought to be that God will be glorified whatever and whenever and by whomever the work is done. I think that every man that loves his master will say, so long as there does but come a harvest, I will not stipulate about who reaps it. Give me faith enough to be assured that the reaping will come, and I will be content. Are we satisfied with that? He uses a couple of examples. William Carey in India, Christopher Wren trying to bring down some of the old walls when he wanted to put up the new St. Paul's Cathedral, and how he battered and battered away, but it seemed like nothing was being accomplished until everything went down at once. We must keep on battering, 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 and at last, though it may not be for another 1,000 years, the Lord will triumph. Though Christ comes quickly, he may not come for another 10,000 years, but in any case, idolatry must die and truth must reign. The accumulated prayers and energies of ages shall do the deed, and God shall be glorified. Only let us persevere in holy effort, and the end is sure. So he says, some of you may think you've had slender success, but you may have a great deal more than you know of. Don't judge by what you can presently see. He says, others may lack success in one place and therefore want to try somewhere else or some other proper method. Well, if we cannot do good in one way, we must do it in another. Bring the matter before God in prayer. Cry mightily to him, for he will help you yet to do it, and his shall be the glory. To bring souls to Christ, says Spurgeon, is my main endeavour, but it's not the ultimate proof of my ministry. My business is to live for God, to lay aside self, and to give myself up wholly to him. And if I do that, I shall be accepted whatever else may happen. Now, Spurgeon had preached this at the Metropolitan Tabernacle, but I think it's worth noting as we reach the conclusion that Spurgeon is writing to his congregation from Menton, where he is laid aside with sickness. One of his closing illustrations. It's said of the old Baptist church over in the city that the members went to Smithfield early one morning to see their pastor burnt, and when someone asked the young people what they went there for, they said that they went to learn the way. That is splendid. They went to learn the way. Oh, go to the Master's cross to learn the way to live and die. See how he spent himself for you, and then sally forth and spend yourselves for him. This, then, is Spurgeon's closing exhortation. The issue is not what you think you are doing and think you're accomplishing and believe is being done. Though you may think that you do not succeed, your wholehearted consecration shall be your honour in the day of the Lord. By your hallowed life and your humble service, you shall bring glory to his name. O Lord, set us in our charges and encourage us in the service of your house. And I do wonder if at least perhaps one of the reasons why Spurgeon chose to publish this sermon on this occasion is that he himself is laid aside. He seems to be, according to the letter with which this sermon concludes, very brief, just a few lines, he seems to be improving in his health and he's looking forward to being back at work. So as you read those particular reminders and rebukes from a man who wants to rouse you up, rally you round, and encourage you to keep rank, remember they come from the heart of a man who has himself been laid aside by sickness and may have had to rebuke himself with regard to some of the temptations that he addresses. Imagine Spurgeon lying on his sickbed thinking that he can do nothing. Imagine him recognizing that he's been laid aside, bemoaning perhaps that he doesn't have the talents and the opportunities that he wishes. Those who are now under great difficulties, those who aren't appreciated. He was often slandered, and probably not Spurgeon perhaps, those who were discouraged because they've had so little success. But it's out of experience that he writes, as well as out of conviction. And in that respect, I hope both his conviction and his experience continue to do good to us today. Thank you once again for listening, and do join us again on another occasion as we try and listen to a sermon from the heart of Spurgeon and learn from him what it means to serve God in our generation.